Right, welcome to my talk on the Hoffmann Ball Bearing Company, 1898 to 1989. Now, the first thing I have to say is that I'm an economic and social historian by trade. I got into this particular talk, I give various talks, but as a result of doing a recent history of Chelmsford. But the point is that I'm not a cool person. There has to be a bit of technology in this talk. If I work for Hoffmann, can put me right at the end, and I mean that at the end because this is a good hour. Right, so ball bearing. It's an engineering term which refers to a type of roller bearing which uses the balls to separate the moving parts of the bearing and that is the machinery, usually to reduce friction. Now, how did the Hoffmann Company come about? Well, you can trace its very roots back to as far as 1750. There was an R. Barrett and Sons operating at the Barbican. Then if you fast forward to the late 19th century, you've got two cousins, Charles and Geoffrey Barrett, and for the bikes they were making, because of course Westminster engineering to the town end of the navigation, the Springfield Basin. The Barretts then started to a firm of electrical engineers and got a lot of experience home and abroad, working mainly in coal mines. But then him to join him in Chelmsford. So how did the actual Hoffmann Company come about? In 1992, which didn't leave the snag on the ball of metal. Now, he had been living in London in 1886 and almost certainly had been doing a lot of research there. But he'd entered America in 1892 and he took out his patents there in 1893. Now, Geoffrey Barrett went out there, persuaded him to come to London and bring his patents with him. And with Hoffmann, the Barretts formed the Hoffmann Manufacturing Company with the then substantial capital of 100,000, 10 million today. To Chelmsford Borough Council to develop just a small plot initially of 4 acres of land on the corner of Rectory Lane and New Street, near what was called Bishop's Hall then. And at the time, this was opposite at an angle to the Chelmsford cricket ground. 14 years later, it was to face the new Marconi factory. vast acres of empty land. And completed in a year, and it only carried back 256 feet. But once the company starts going, as we'll see, getting going, there were additions every year from 1906 until 1921, right back to the Chelmsford. Now, another factor in because it needed large amounts of steel for its furnaces, so it soon had a siding, ended up with several sidings. Right, so was Ernst Hoffmann line was that he was the impractical, only interested in tinkering with his patents rather than the urgent matter of making the machines to make the steel balls. But in the 1960s, a manager of the factory. He sent a number of letters to steel manufacturers about the types of steel needed, and that the firm remained dependent on Hoffmann's patents for a number of years. Workers remembered Hoffmann as a One thing that the Barretts were good at was good departmental managers, and they recruited a Otto Schmidt, who had spotted that a Christian Hill had developed a new method of grinding the balls, but he had a patent that was about to run out. So Geoffrey Barrett went over to America and successfully bought these patents. But it was several years after 1998 before the firm started producing the balls. They kept with their bicycle hub production. They also made penny in the slot machines. They also launched an fully automatic photographic machine covering all the processes. Now, production of these machines had to was switched from Barbican to Chelmsford, while the machines to make the balls were being got ready. Now the pressure was really on. Geoffrey Barrett had to hotfoot it to London to get extra cash to pay the firm's workers, and the pressure told on Charles Barrett. He had a breakdown because of the pressure, and he was absent for 15 months. He had a second breakdown and then passed away during the war. But the company did begin to expand after Hoffmann left. They had two works managers, the Witte brothers, and a chap called Detert. They were all Germans. But the company began to benefit from starting production at the right time. The bicycle craze had passed, but you're beginning to get rapidly increasing demand for motor cars and the first experiments with flight, because Hoffmann's was always a feeder company. In these industries, particularly the car and airplane industries, were always going to be big demanders of Hoffmann bearings. So they started designing their own, like a thrust bearing for crane hooks, which allowed for rotation between its parts. And it took out its first patent for a journal bearing, where the journal is part of the shaft that slides over the bearing surface. Now, in these early years, two things started to take shape at the company, which remained the case for several decades. And one was readiness to advertise and get publicity with the trades that were going to use their products. So, for example, they actually had a stand at the first car exhibition at Olympia, and Hoffmann was already supplying Austin, Napier and Rolls-Royce. The second thing that they started doing, but they did a lot more of in the interwar period, as we'll see, was getting publicity from supplying cars that took part in races. So Rolls-Royce won the Tourist Trophy race of 1906 with a car fitted with Hoffmann bearings. So, and this is the de Havilland biplane, an early plane which used Hoffmann bearings. Right, so you started from a very small base, 1898, just 10 workers, a steady expansion to the outbreak of war. So in 1914 there were 1,800 workers, still pretty large for, well, Chelmsford was still a pretty small town then. But then you got, as we'll see, big expansion during the war. And by 1921, there were almost 5,000 working at the firm. And as I say, it was always what we call a capital-intensive industry. So in the first 25 years, the amount of capital used, invested in equipment in particular, a new power plant and so on, increased sevenfold. Right, so this is one of their first with the bicycle trade magazines. This is an advert for journal bearings. If you look at the bottom right, what do you notice about the telephone number? So they got the number. They weren't slow off the mark. Another feature of the firm throughout its history was the emphasis on accuracy. And again, this is an early advert saying guaranteed, correct to standard size, 1 to 10,000th of an inch. Again, this is a 1905 autocar advert showing Hoffmann bearings, front and back axles, with the balls showing. This pre-war advert emphasises global nature of Hoffmann. Even then, they were exporting to all parts of the globe. Right, now when I did the chapter in my book on Hoffmann, I made great use of something called the Hoffmann Employment Register, which can be found at Sanford Mill. And the company started it before they were actually even producing anything. So it starts in July 1898. It included name and address of who was employed, when they were taken on, when they left and why, their occupation within the firm, and other remarks. So for the first few months, the original factory was being built, so you just had small numbers of carpenters, painters and general labourers being taken on. Then when the equipment is being installed, you have fitters and pattern makers, like the machinery were being employed. And all of these, to begin with, were employed on a daily rate. Okay? And then you have the first wiremen or electricians being taken on. And Christie's played a prominent role in lighting the factory. Now, Hoffmann's, the employment register shows, were tough employers. So a fitter employed very early in 1898 was let go for being slow. A stoker of the furnace was let go for not being steady. Another fitter was let go because he was not used to our class of work. The chain of command was seen as vital. So yet another fitter left for fighting with the foreman. Just when production was getting going, you have a steady flow of workers departing because they were, in the company's words or word, lazy. You couldn't say that today, could you? Now, another term which crops up in the register as a reason for departure is union man. Now, with the local firms, Hoffmann wasn't the only firm locally to have early on a problem with unions. R.E. Crompton did as well. Things change, as we'll see. But right. So another thing that the register shows was that you have the first apprentices being taken on. Even there, one leaves after only 2 months because he wanted to learn a trade and be paid high wages at the same time. So, after a decade, workers start leaving of their own accord, and this is for the obvious reason that you begin to have in Chelmsford a pool of labour, because you've got other firms, you've got Marconi, Crompton, Christie and so on, and even if they don't have particular skills, they have some experience, so they can transfer to other firms. Now the register shows that almost all the workers in these early years lived very locally in Chelmsford, Moulton and Springfield. There was one or two far afield as Great Waltham and Writtle, and then Sandon and Margaretting. But you had to start at 7:30, you had long hours. This time it was normally a 55-hour week. and so most wanted just to walk in, or at most a short cycle ride. Another thing that the register shows that was that by the First War you have more permanent staff, and these, the register shows, are beginning to live in bigger houses. If you know your old Moulton, like some of those in Mildmay Road that have been built then. Right. A further thing that the register shows was that, like Marconi, the firm was employing significant numbers of women before the First War. Most were teenagers, mostly in the packing department rather than in the factory to begin with, whereas the male teenagers were taken on to be trained up. Right, so the unions. By the time of the war, the company had been increasingly forced to negotiate with the unions. There was a small stoppage in 1910, and that resulted in the Works Committee being set up. But there was a much more serious stoppage in 1913. And there was a local workers' union leader, Terrell Smith, and workers' union became the TGWU eventually. He was asking for Hoffmann workers to get an increase of halfpence an hour for a 55-hour week because of, you guessed it, increased cost of living in the town. Where have we heard that before? Anyway, after 2 weeks they weren't getting anywhere, and he had the presence of mind to invite the local MP, Prettyman, to mediate. And as a result, 300 odd machine attendants and general labourers got their minimum rates raised. Now, Cobbold, in his history of the company that I mentioned, said that in these early days, local people tended to regard Hoffmann as rather an inferior place to work compared with the other big firms. But he said this tended to ebb away after the first decade. Well, having listened to various interviews with Hoffmann workers of the 1910s, 1920s, most of these interviews were done some time ago, obviously. I'm not completely convinced by that. Okay, so anyway, in 1910 you've got 1,400 men almost turning out 1.5 million ball bearings a day, and if I can read this, you have a reporter from the Chronicle being shown round by a works manager, and he said 12 years ago the factory was driven by a steam engine. Today there is an immense powerhouse with two 300 horsepower dynamos. Another 300 horsepower dynamo is likely to be added. Outside the powerhouse there's a huge collection of retorts for the manufacture of gas. Hoffmann is quite self-contained and does everything for itself. Oil was used to keep knives and the bars cool and reduce friction, which would have damaged the tools. One shop had a drilling machine, which was invented by various members of the staff. It was supposed to be the fastest machine of its kind in the world at the time. This is a group of the young men and women, more or less at the outbreak of the war. Right. Now, the government, when the war broke out, the government realised that ball bearings would be a strategic industry. So they took over the whole Hoffmann business for war purposes. But Geoffrey Barrett was given the responsibility for all the country's production of ball bearings. And there had to be a big expansion. And they submitted plans to the council for a new power station, extension to the grinding and hardening shops, and new sewers. But of course there was nobody to actually build, because everybody was out, was away fighting the war. So in the last 18 months of the war, the extensions did get built, in the main by German prisoners of war. Quite a few of them came from Chelmsford workhouse where they were being kept. Why this big expansion? Well, Hoffmann bearings were used in practically every type of equipment, military equipment, from gun turrets on ships to tanks and biplanes. Now, Andrew Clark, who was a vicar of Great Lees and had his diaries published, he said that 1,000 workers left the firm during the war. So this and the big increase in demand meant that there had to be a big increase in women into the factory, actually working inside the factory, not just packing. And they had to set up a training school in Springfield Road. Now, Hoffmann, like the other big firms in the town, promised to re-engage all those men who'd either enlisted or been conscripted, and this happened. But as we'll see, although a lot of women were replaced, they retained an important role in the factory because they proved very good at vetting products by eye, looking for blemishes and so on. That's one of the sidings. That's the women, 1914, with their caps on to make sure their hair didn't get tangled up in the machinery. That's a Spalding photo showing one of the extensions being built in 1918. That's the roll of honour of the those Hoffmann workers who died during the war. I believe it's kept at the cathedral now. That's a post-war postcard showing basically the expansion of the firm back towards the River Chelmer. And that's a similar period photo. Now, this chart really shows the importance of Hoffmann by after the war, employing more than 3,000 people, 3,000 workers. Not only was that twice the next biggest firm, Crompton, but if you add up all the other firms, including Crompton, Hoffmann had more employment than all of them put together in 1925. Right, so the interwar period. Geoffrey Barrett retires in 1921. When he dies in 1923, he leaves a fortune of more than 400,000, probably more than 20 million today, showing how successful the firm had been. For most of the interwar period, there were two joint managing directors, a Pryke and a TW Cooper. Now the site has to be extended again because the existing site had become too cramped. You couldn't go beyond the Chelmsford, so they start building on Rectory Lane and the site of the current Anglia Ruskin, as we'll see. Now, to begin with, the company has problems after the war. It's hit by a railway strike, so it couldn't get steel. It's hit by the general strike. But the continued expansion in demand for cars in particular in the 20s and especially the 30s meant that the firm wasn't as affected by the Depression as firms in older industries like shipbuilding and cotton and coal and so on elsewhere in the country. Now, it's the 30s in particular when the company gains a great deal of publicity through its bearings being used in numerous record attempts like Malcolm Campbell's Thunderbolt, John Cobb, an Englishman who broke the land speed record at Brooklands. And in 1930, the first 5 cars in the Le Mans 24-hour race were all fitted with Hoffmann ball bearings. And you had something called the King's Cup Air Race, which was flown, it was only open to British pilots. And in 31, 32 and 33, all the planes in it, every engine used Hoffmann bearings. So that's Malcolm Campbell, that's John Cobb. Right, so by 1938, just before the war, 4,500 workers worked for the firm. Now, the firm did have long service. In 1938, over 40 of them had 30 years service plus. But in general, it didn't have the same sort of long service as Marconi. There was various reasons for this, but one was that being a feeder firm for other industries, it was always very susceptible to what we call fluctuations in the trade cycle, economic prosperity. So at Hoffmann, during there was a post-war boom, and a general labourer could get pretty good wages of well over £3 a week during that boom. But during the recession that followed, wages were cut by a third. And that was if you were lucky enough to hang on to your job. And certainly at this time, Hoffmann weren't slow in shedding labour if it felt they weren't needed. On the other hand, to be positive about the firm, it certainly pushed its own sick club, health insurance. Some people felt that the firm tried to be a bit too controlling. Certainly it was against a similar contributory scheme started by the local Chelmsford and Essex Hospital in the 1930s. But it was certainly resolute also in pushing its pension scheme, and by the war nearly all permanent staff belonged to it and most hourly rate men. Right, Hoffmann could be a dangerous place to work. You're talking about 1,000 degrees plus blast furnace temperatures, some dangerous machinery. So it had its own surgery, a trained nurse, and an ambulance, because some accidents were inevitable, but they prided themselves on their low accident record. Something that Hoffmann had that Marconi didn't have was a large canteen that could take over 700 people. Now, well before the First World War, Hoffmann had started its sport and social club, and by 1939 it had 30 sections. The sports ground was opened in 1919 in Rainsford Road, and there were a whole raft of football teams, but the first 11, if you like, had long runs in the Amateur Cup and the FA Cup, and Hoffmann's cricket ground was good enough to be used for Essex County cricket matches as late as the late 1960s. It had its own bowling green before the First War. It had its own quoits pitch. When I read about this, I had to look it up because I didn't know what quoits was. They took part in the town's billiards tournament. But again, even before the First War, they were organising big works outings by train to Yarmouth and so on. Before the war, they had things called smokers' concerts, would you believe? These were replaced after the war by whist drives, and Hoffmann were very big at parties and dances. For a long time in the 60s and 70s, they were reckoned to have the best sprung dance floor in the town. Hoffmann was heavily involved with the early carnivals in the town in the 1920s, and there was an evening fete at the sports ground during the first carnival. That's the Essex playing at Rainsford Road sports ground. Right, so in the 1930s the firm is doing very well. Right, so you have a works manager giving a speech in 1933 where he says, both the electric and gas plants of the works are bigger than those that supplied the town. The firm has power stations, consignments with 8 countries. The social club, he goes on to say, the social club is a great thing to stop communism and dissatisfaction. When you're playing cricket, I love this. When you're playing cricket, it doesn't matter whether you're the manager or a labourer. You are all playing the same game. Wonderful. Right, so the firm was doing very well, record sales, record profits, because by this time most cars used between 20 and 30 roller bearings, and bearings are used in virtually every industrial machine. So Hoffmann bearings are used in telescopes, elevators, artificial limbs, etc. And they've still got traditional products like the axle boxes in on trains. So you've got a new batch of trains for the Piccadilly line in 1934. Now, not everybody at this time in the interwar period had the same rosy view of Hoffmann, it has to be said, as a chap like Brown. A F.W. Warner joined the firm just before the First War, and he was 13. He remembered the discipline being very strict. He worked from 7:30 until 12, and then restarted at 1 until 6. There was no union to begin with, but he joined one when it became established. Now Warner himself was laid off in the recession that I mentioned, and he was unemployed for 2 years. But then what does he do? He restarts his job back at Hoffmann on £3 a week in 1922. Mrs. Claydon worked at Hoffmann in the 1920s, checking for flaws in the bearings, what I mentioned before. But when she married at the age of 24, she was not allowed to continue, because that was the custom at the time. This changes in the 1930s. Lastly, the delightfully named Percy Rainbird. He worked for Crompton, but then his dad got him a job at Hoffmann. So in the 1920s, he's working a 48-hour week. But by the 1930s, 7 of his extended family were working at the factory. Several of the women graded and sorted different sized balls. By the time he married in 1930, his wages were still only 48 shillings a week, but he managed to get a council house on the Baldy Farms. The rent was 13 shillings a week. Now, in this interview that I listened to with him, he said that nearly all his life was tied to Hoffmann. He and his wife, who worked there in the 30s. They went to whist drives together. They belonged to the Sick Club, one of the football teams. Now, his wife actually becomes a supervisor in charge of 60 other workers. And they worked all hours during the war. Which brings us on to the war. Now, the Hoffmann, like Marconi, was always going to be a big target for German aircraft. And there were 4 attacks. In July 1942, a lone raider got lucky, bombed Hoffmann and nearby houses and killed 4 people. Production was hit for a while because of the damage to the lapping room, smoothed the balls. They were lucky that there was no regular shift working at the time, or there'd been a greater loss of life. But there was a lot of criticism because no sirens went off and the attack defences failed to fire. Then later that year you got one bomb causing a direct hit on the works, but penetrating the roof and exploding in the assembly shop. It only put out of operation 8 machines, but they were key machines, and 6 weeks production was lost. The third attack was pretty inconsequential. It was part of the incendiary raid on the town. There was a bit of damage to a Hoffmann store at the old National School. Okay, this is the first attack in July 1942, and it was the bombs on the lapping shop that did the damage, as shown by this photo. Now the Germans tried to get some propaganda out of it. You look at the bottom. Important ball bearing works near Chelmsford were attacked, and several hits were scored by one German bomber. And this was the second attack. the single bomb that detonated there by Henry Road. Of course, the bomb that caused the most destruction really anywhere in Chelmsford during the war was the V2, which fell in December 1944. Right, 30 Hoffmann workers were killed, and 8 who weren't Hoffmann employees. Most of them were young women just coming back from a carol service. Now, Bertie Upson was a member of the firm's ARP and was one of the first on the scene. He said there was a festive spirit amongst the workers at Hoffmann that early morning, but there came a blinding flash, a roar, then chaos. People were trapped. The screams of the dying and the injured were distressing. Bertie recalled, "I shouted at the girls to get out." He told them to go to the canteen that hadn't been hit. "I kept 4 fellows back with me and said we had to help. We got bodies and people who had been injured and half carried them out. A nurse told them not to bring any more bodies to the surgery, only those who were injured." Would you believe it? Bertie was offered a new pair of shoes because the soles of his shoes had been burnt off. You could say that was big of the firm, but perhaps I'm being harsh. Okay, so that's the V2. That's Bertie. I think he passed away in 2012 by Globe House. That's the wreckage still burning after the bomb. This was 5 weeks after, right? Still showing more or less complete devastation, and that shows more of the twisted steelwork. That's a memorial to those that lost their life. Right, now, after the war, Hoffmann produced a small pamphlet called "We Also Served," for example, they highlighted that a typical Lancaster bomber, the basic aircraft alone included 950 bearings. Then you got all the equipment in the aircraft that used bearings, gyroscopes, air position indicators, automatic pilots, cameras. And then you've got the backup to the aircraft, the bomb loading trolleys, bomb winches, floodlights, all using a multitude of bearings. Away from the aircraft, you've got Sten guns. Hoffmann bearings were used to retain the fire control mechanism. And in the army, the most popular field gun used 5 Hoffmann journal bearings. This was a poster, rather good poster, isn't it, that they used in the factory to emphasise to the workers how important their work was. It's not subtle, but effective. Right, so Hoffmann made more than 70 million copper balls for shell primers during the war. Hoffmann bearings were used for motor generators and hand-driven generators for portable radios. In each tank, the turret ring had 72 steel balls. and thrust bearings in ack guns. So in the whole war, the company actually made a staggering 2,500 million balls and rollers, and hundreds of thousands of complete ball and roller bearings. But perhaps the most staggering statistic is that at the end of the war, the company was employing a never to be exceeded 10,000 people. Obviously a lot of them in night shift, but really astonishing in the size of Chelmsford's size at the time. This you may have seen at the museum, when the story goes that when the American soldiers were going through German airfields at the end of the war, they came across this model of Hoffmann and Marconi and the railway line, and it had been used obviously to brief and prepare German pilots. Right, so how are we doing for time? Not too bad. Post-war, you have a new managing director called Barton, who comes from a firm called Brown Bailey. Hoffmann, like all other industries, has problems after the war with energy problems, but they're also finding it difficult. They wanted to switch what they called unproductive workers who were in administration back into the factory. They found it difficult to attract new workers to the town because there was a big housing shortage, and if you think transport across the town is difficult today, it was a whole lot worse then. But by 1948, the Hoffmann works had settled at just over 5,000 workers, half the wartime peak. Barton was already warning that overseas markets were being lost. But in the 1950s, the big increase, especially for motor cars, tended to mask the competition, the foreign competition. Hoffmann has its jubilee, 50 years young, 1898 to 1948. That's its bookmark, showing all its achievements and major developments. That's an aerial photo showing the scale of the expanded firm in 1945. But in the 1950s, most of the workers still lived within 10 miles of Chelmsford. Many of them used the Eastern National special buses put on for them. The works has its own training school on site now. By the 1960s, it's beginning to get publicity, not from racing cars, but use of what you might call micro bearings, I suppose, in satellites. But the 60s see the onset of severe competition, particularly from the Japanese. So from 1962 to 1965, profits more than halved. One of the difficulties was that the company was hit by a series of disputes. Now, by this time, production was more assembly line and conveyor belt, and it meant that small groups of workers, if they came out on strike, could have a major effect on production. The connection with British trades, different British firms, is still there, like the railways and companies like Rover Cars. That's the micro bearing mentioned. Another firm with Hoffmann going back well over 50 years was Rolls-Royce aero engines. The problem was that by the 60s, firms like Hoffmann were smaller scale and less productive than their continental counterparts. Now, Labour called the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation to force through rationalisation in industries like ball bearings. Now, the IRC had taken over Brown Bailey, and that firm immediately took a 60% stake in Hoffmann. And there was the formation of RHP, eventually, Ransom Hoffmann Pollard. Well, it was announced in 1969, didn't actually start till 1970. Now, Ransom dates back to the First War in Newark in Nottinghamshire. Until the start of the pandemic, its Stanley Works at Newark were still going. Were part of a Japanese conglomerate. So until quite recently, Pollard Bearings were a Northampton firm. Now, Hoffmann itself in the early 70s did pretty well. Big increase in productivity through greater automation. But the chairman of RHP is pleading with the government to restrict Japanese imports of bearings. But at the same time, he was saying to the Chelmsford works that the remaining, it was then reduced to 2,800 workers, jobs were safe. And it looked for a while that was true, because £2 million was spent on a fully automated assembly line. And I believe they had an open day when the public could go along and have a look. But then you got the 3-day week with the power cuts in 1973, and the incredibly strange decision to give a Japanese firm a whopping great grant to build a ball bearing plant in a development area in northeast Britain. So by 1981, production has fallen to 1,500 workers. And in 1987, you have the announcement that the firm is going to close. Now, I've got some quotes by Mick McDonough, who had been an apprentice, and he was a divisional manager when the boss announced the news. There was a visible ripple through our people on the shop floor. One very big man who had mortgaged himself to the hilt collapsed and was taken to the medical centre. RHP was a family. It was a harsh industrial environment with people working near furnace temperatures of 1250 degrees. They looked after each other, respected each other's skills. The harsher the environment, the more the feeling of all in it together. On night shifts, they got up to all sorts of scams. One crew rebuilt a Model T Ford, while another had a nice little sideline in staircases made from bearing steel. There were ample eels in Chelmsford alongside the factory, despite or because of industrial discharges. On the night shift, guys would throw eels in the scorching rotary hearth, and by the time they came back, they were cooked perfectly. Right, so the works finally closed in 1989, and the bearing productions transferred to Newark. So you got all that skill and experience is lost. As you possibly know, there's only one part of the factory still survives, that's Globe House. I'll to that in a minute. Now, this is a plan from the, I think the late 1970s or early 1980s of RHP. It has an interesting provenance. It's more than a metre across. It was difficult to photo, it's now in the record office, but Neil Whiffin, who now works there, when he was a student, he was passing by the derelict works, spotted this plan lying there on top of a skip, and thought, oh, that looks interesting. So it spent the next few years in his family loft, the story goes, but it's now in the record office. So that's the one part of the original factory that's still there, Globe House. That's the McDonough brothers. That's the blue plaque. Spot the not deliberate mistake. Should be Ernst Gustav Hoffmann. My wife said I'm being picky, but I think you've got to get these things right.